Hello, my dear friends. How is it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to talk about the religious practice in Nordic paganism. This is one of those subjects I have been constantly receiving questions about and loads of messages, and I think it is important to underline a few key factors. So today I'm going to present a general understanding of the religious practice in Nordic paganism, something quite brief just to catch the basic notions and for those who are seeking to find the primary foundations of this religious manifestation. I'm going to focus on a general understanding and deliver a couple of factors which are always important to take in mind before we delve into the study of pre-Christian religions and belief systems. This video today, unlike previous videos, won't have a bibliography by the end because this video is the culmination of several videos I have already done before, for which I have presented bibliography, videos where I have delved and presented a lot more details concerning a variety of subjects that we can place under the umbrella of Nordic paganism. So for more information on specific details concerning this subject or this theme, please explore the other videos and bibliography presented so far. Once again, this video today is just a general overview, a synthesis of past videos concerning Nordic paganism and the religious practice. The sciences of religions must always be supported by an interdisciplinary approach in order to promote reflections of this phenomenon in the human societies. Therefore, a study on religion, whatever it may be, must take into account literature, history, archaeology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, among other areas of the human sciences in order to have a better understanding of these subjects. Religion and spirituality are phenomena with a multitude of variants, both in theoretical and practical terms, so the search for the understanding of these vast worlds of human thought and how the human interacts with the spiritual is always something fascinating, and as such we must also strive to comprehend and deepen our understanding concerning these matters. To better understand each other and what makes the human being such a special species and so eager to communicate and express itself that it is even capable of doing so with entities beyond the human social sphere. So, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends. Please. As has been said before in a video that I present here in this upper right corner, it is quite normal that Nordic paganism has created a great fascination in the imagination of many people. Usually this fascination comes from movies, TV series, pop culture in general, that often doesn't present any kind of concrete historical content and relies heavily on fantasies and assumed knowledge. This is also a perfectly normal impulse because until recently there were few concrete and in-depth studies on Nordic paganism and on paganism in general for that matter, usually only relying on epigraphs or later written sources which are always quite biased as they are usually a representation of the beliefs and wishes of the persons who have created such sources. In terms of Nordic paganism, especially from the Iron Age, little concrete is known, and in archaeological terms as well. So not much is known about pagan Nordic religiosity and practice, mostly. Hence, there have been quite a few fantasies to fill in the gaps. This then is the first thing to say about this topic, that we know relatively little about it. Archaeology, however, having finally become a science in the 50s of the 20th century, progressively moving away from a biased political thought and with the evolution of new technologies, has given us extensive information. However, even the archaeological context requires a process of interpretation, giving rise to several theories which can certainly be proposed as long as there are evidences to defend the theories proposed. But the human mentality, the practice, the meaning, the significance, and what led people to have certain behaviors and display their belief systems in a way that led to the creation of material culture, it's not there. Intention and religious thought itself simply disappears with the death of persons who had very specific and individual beliefs. Also, in academic discussions, the concept of religion differs considerably depending on what a theory considers relevant to the religious scope, which also varies according to the technologies that are available to us. For instance, archaeological discoveries and scientific research methods that can contribute to new theories. But we also have to take into consideration the ideology or ideologies in which the researchers are inserted, which can create quite the biased theory because contexts are being interpreted through the individual understanding of the researcher. So, we really know very little about religious practice in Nordic paganism. Certainly too little or very few concrete details to be able to faithfully recreate it today, which is why the neo-pagan rituals and traditions of the world today should not be considered reconstructions, but creations freely inspired by motives derived from the past. This does not mean that these current creations are to be condemned. Every religion was somehow invented or developed at some historical moment. And I personally, as a pagan and as an archaeologist, do not condemn the way other neo-pagans choose to express their spiritual feelings within a specific belief, because we mustn't also forget that paganism has always been evolving and has always been a product of a very strong religious and cultural syncretism. However, it is important to clearly distinguish ancient history from the current history and historical developments and not mix things up to avoid further confusion and misconceptions. Obviously, it is not just archaeology that has given us some information. In fact, as was said earlier, today's archaeology is much better and much more reliable, not only due to technological developments, but mainly because it is no longer done by amateurs of the European nobility who simply interpreted things according to their own personal beliefs, not only religious, but also political and in a social economic context. In terms of Nordic religion, there are still some mythological tales, essentially contained in two texts, Poetic Edda and the Edda in prose, the Prose Edda. However, therein lies a big problem. Before archaeology was what it is today, 99% of the study of ancient pre-Christian societies was based on the study of epigraphs or literary sources that spoke about the religions of those times, which, I say it again, often presents a personal religious sense and quite political, and also turned to the perceptions of the person who composed these texts. In the case of the Eddas, we clearly have important contents that report to pre-Christian mythological bases of Scandinavia, but also a great weight of Judeo-Christian religious understandings. And it is often quite difficult to understand what really are the pagan understandings or mentalities in these sources. But returning to these sources, the Eddas, in the first case, the Poetic Edda, which are poems with mythological, moral, and epic themes, and in the second case, the Prose Edda, it is an erudite treatment of the mythical heritage and its use in poetry. There are also some events narrated in the sagas, of course, where some elements of pagan religion, temples and sacrifices are briefly described, but as we shall see further ahead or later on, nothing detailed enough to serve as a guide for those who want to recreate this specific religious sphere. I know there is also generally this idea that the loss of knowledge of this pre-Christian Scandinavian cultural world is due to the Christian religious world. This idea of blaming Christianity, which I confess I too have been blaming Christians who came from outside to exercise with systemic violence their control over the lives of the free pagan populations who lived happily in contact with nature. However, this is not entirely true, because Christianity in Scandinavia was known long before the Christian Scandinavian kings began to force Christianity upon their subjects. In fact, it is very well documented that Christianization of Scandinavia was mainly due to internal forces, and that its most passionate promoters were Scandinavians, and not only among the aristocracy but also among the people, the common folk, the general people, especially during the culmination of the Iron Age in Scandinavia, usually known as the Viking Age, in which Christianity and other religions and beliefs began to be adopted more, and there was an even greater religious and cultural syncretism. And we see this especially in Viking Age graves, as an example, at least since the 9th century, when there are many pagan and Christian elements in the everyday material culture of the Old Norse people's belief systems. In Iceland, conversion took place by decision of the General Assembly and not because it was forced, Catholicism becoming the official religion of Iceland in the year 1000 of the Common Era. As much as it pains my past self to say this, the fact that paganism was not preserved is because there was no interest in it, not anymore. As Scandinavians started to have more contact with the medieval world, be it Christian, Jewish, Islamic, or even Hindu, and other beliefs outside Scandinavia, it starts to generate a greater interest on other beliefs because they are new, they are exotic, they are different. Several accounts concerning the mythological reality were transmitted because they had a literary function, just like the myths of classical paganism. It is important to have this in our minds before we begin to want to understand pre-Christian Nordic religiosity. This religious and cultural phenomenon is perfectly normal among pagan peoples. Paganism was never a question of preserving a pure knowledge or a great effort and endeavor to preserve a cultural identity and a historical religious heritage. Quite the contrary. In fact, this idea of trying to preserve a cultural identity and spiritual purity in terms of paganism is a modern idea. Paganism was always a matter of bringing together various faiths and various belief systems, bringing together not only what was pleasing to the pagan person, but also what was functional and practical in the pagan person's day-to-day life. The more deities at hand, the more it was possible to create a relationship with them. And the better for the pagan person, the more advantages and an increase in possible success in daily life. The possibility of success was augmented because the gods were not properly seen as divine beings in a plane detached from the human world or reality, but in fact entities with whom an interaction was possible, and that, like other beings that appear in folklore, the gods also inhabited the natural world, the natural landscape in which humans were also part of and were inserted in. A much more animistic understanding. Hence, Christ became yet another deity which was joined to existing pagan pantheons. That's why it's important to reflect on this, because Christianity in Scandinavia was already quite present long before it was forced by political religious forces. Incidentally, it is still well noticed in the traditional folk magic of Scandinavia, especially in Trolldom, in Sweden, this religious syncretism where the pagan and the Christian and others meet, giving rise not only to a very rich practical witchcraft, but also increasing the possibility of success in the practice and in the spell that is administered. Because there are more elements from different cultures that are brought together and put into practice. This is paganism of the past and of the present, a continuous evolution according to people's needs, wishes, desires, and what is appealing. With what was previously said in mind, let us now try to understand specifically the practical aspects of pre-Christian Nordic religion, that is, of the reality of cults that dotted Scandinavia before its Christianization, which took place between the first and the second millennia. I will only focus on practical and not on morals and ethical understandings, all right? Or we would never get this done, at least not today. What we know about the places, objects, and ceremonies of pre-Christian Old Norse religions, mainly. So let's start with some factors to once and for all abandon existing prejudices that greatly limit knowledge about the past and also create a lot of misinformation and misconceptions that have become common knowledge. Just give me 1 second. They are destroying everything. So, whether we like it or not, it's a question we will eventually have to accept. There's no historical continuity between Nordic paganism and today's neo-pagan religions. Christianization constituted a clear break, not only in Scandinavia, but in terms of paganism in general, and paganism was rediscovered for the first time in the modern era and redesigned in the Romantic period, only to be remade and reimagined in the contemporary era, often in the popular panorama of the New Age religions. The rupture is clear, and today we are not continuing a linear paganism but only building neo-pagan religions, which, as was said before, religions inspired by some motifs of the past. Even though in folklore we have concrete evidences of pagan themes and a very deep animistic past, these tales have also undergone high changes, especially due to the medieval literary genre, romance, which despite evoking certain pagan beliefs and landscapes, there was a clear romanticism to place these themes within Christian morals and ethics. Also, it has often been suggested that pagan practices survived in secret for all these centuries, and it was only resurfaced recently, giving the idea that original pagan practices of the past are simply coming out from hiding, and we get to experience paganism again as it was. Unfortunately, these are very unverifiable claims and not at all supported by a scientific background of an interdisciplinary nature. It is necessary to understand that some pagan motifs, as I said earlier, are still present in folklore, but also in traditional folk magic, commonly known as witchcraft. But witchcraft itself is not a strand that preserves the paganism of the past as it was. Witchcraft, like paganism, has been a form of practical expression that has undergone various currents of cultural and religious syncretism. And despite retaining a lot of information from a pagan past as well, it is quite well mixed and altered with various religious and magical influences from various sources and cultures and time periods. So a pagan practice was not preserved in witchcraft, but instead it gave rise to various practices that have been changed and increased precisely due to the contact that human populations maintain with each other, exchanging information and practice and belief systems. It must also be understood that the very integration of pre-Christian traditions into the Christian religious world cannot be taken as an indication of the pagan practices of a particular people, nor can it be considered to be paganism retained within Christianity. No historical religion was born from nothing, spontaneously, and it is normal that every religion adopts, recovers, or incorporates elements of previous cults and new cults and belief systems. So we do not know for sure if the pagan elements within Christianity are pagan indeed, and from where and from which period, because even yearly celebrations that we think are pagan, in several points they are not pagan, and even yearly pagan celebrations changed quite a lot in the pagan past, especially the dates and moments of celebration and the meanings. Even pagans of the past changed quite a lot their own celebrations and adopted motifs from other pagan cultures and changed the days and periods of their own celebrations. Religion is the adoption of more religions and more traditions. Even Christianity is modeled differently from place to place. Even the Christianity practiced today is not the Christianity practiced 1,000 years ago. And even the Christianity of today in one country is not equal to the Christianity practiced in another country next to it. Although more of this religion has been preserved, obviously, not only because of a greater amount of preserved sources, but also because to this day there has been a continuity of Christian practices which has not yet suffered a brutal rupture as paganism did. But even so, even Christianity has changed a great deal, let alone paganism of the past. Returning to Nordic paganism, it is also often suggested, in a very romantic and even naive way, that the people of the North maintained a pagan spirit and that today people in Nordic countries are more likely to practice the paganism of the past because it has been retained in their mindset. This is also false, not only for Nordic peoples, but also for all societies that have gone through various historical moments that have altered our perceptions of the world at various points, even among indigenous animistic peoples. Modern Northern European societies are based on Christian morals like many other societies. In fact, someone said something quite interesting, and I unfortunately don't remember who said it, I'm sorry, but the person said it. Modern Nordic societies are so rooted in Christian morals and ethics that this is why they insist on helping the poor, the sick, and the elderly, rather than seeing them as a burden as pagan societies saw them. Whether we admit it or not, European societies, modern societies, are quite rooted in Christianity, even in terms of the law, where we have the right to settle disputes in a diplomatic and peaceful way, and the state assumes the duty to administer justice and not leave it to the clans and tribes that settled things through bloody feuds. This is an important point to remember because we romanticize ancient paganism a lot as if it were a golden age and that Christianity came to ruin everything. Of course, there were a lot of bad things that Christianity brought, and there was a lot of suffering and death, especially in the modern era, and the extensive witch hunts between 1580 and 1640. Which was not hunting down remaining pagans but a religious war because Western Christianity was torn in half by the Reformation. So we actually have wars between Christians and among Christians, a hunt for Christians who opposed every Christian religious faction and not a hunt for pagans who still existed at the time. But this does not serve as a factor that we were better off as pagans because pre-Christian societies were brutal, and much that was considered normal in pagan traditions, in the paganism of the past, and morals and ethics, today constitutes crimes that are severely punishable, such as sacrificing children or abandoning people of any age to die. There is no golden age in the history of human societies. We were never totally nice folks. If anything, even with the conflicts going on today, we are far more peaceful and diplomatic and sensible these days. As I said in other videos, it is also important to not see and to not understand the paganism of the past as we see and understand the religions of today, especially how the Christian religion is structured, which immediately gives us an idea of religion as something structural, unique, with a specific canon and a uniformity that obeys to a single belief. Norse paganism, like any paganism, was not a centralized and dogmatical cult. It had no textual canon, it had no institutionalized dogmas, laws, and rituals. It was a universe of different cults and traditions in constant evolution. This is why today there is no real process of reconstructionism of a pagan liturgy and a tradition, because paganism varied greatly in space and time. It is impossible to reconstruct a Nordic pagan religion because it was never cohesive, something uniform, but instead a countless mix of alterable and easily moldable and adaptable belief systems, even in a local, regional, and geographical panorama, always moving and always evolving. And it is impossible to know all the pagan systems of belief, even down to a single small social scale. What is possible to do, and what we have been doing concerning paganism, is the creation of neo-pagan religions based on elements and motifs of the past. And that is not necessarily bad, mind you, because we are meant to evolve. In fact, further on, not on, I would like to address this issue of religion and what we mean or understand by religion and what makes a belief a religion, precisely to better understand the disputes between academics and who study religions, as well as between people in general, and the reluctance to call religion a pagan belief system. But we will see this further ahead in response to a question actually posed to me by one of my patrons. As already established, we know little about the pre-Christian Nordic religious world and practice, mostly the practice, and it is for this reason that the religious rituals of present-day neo-pagan groups are, for the most part, newly invented. However, I emphasize once again, I see nothing wrong with the neo-pagan expressions precisely because when there is a lack of practical knowledge, we invent, reinvent, and adapt according to the needs and in the way we want to express ourselves, both individually and collectively, and how we want to express our feelings and what comes from within. This is just like traditional folk magic, which is highly pragmatic. We express ourselves according to the momentary need. It is a constant experimentation and continuous experience until we succeed. And that is how we gain knowledge that we will then continuously use and adapting, changing and evolving whenever we are face to face with an obstacle. And the knowledge gained is through the interactions we create and the relationships built with the persons or entities we express ourselves to or towards to. What works for some people may not work for others. As such, we adapt practice and our own expressions according to our own mind and self-identifications. Well, in terms of practice, finally, what do we know about ancient cults and expressions of belief in the Nordic panorama? Well, without counting with the knowledge of unverifiable personal gnosis acquired through the spiritual experiences of each one of us and the relationships we create with other than human persons, for a scientific study alone, we have several sources that fit into two categories. Historical literary sources, therefore the information transmitted in the texts, which are mostly, almost all of them, Icelandic, and focusing on what was the end of the Middle Ages in Europe. So right there, we have several temporal, geographical, socio-political limitations and also a type of mentality that is already quite different from the pagan past. The other sources are the archaeological sources, where we can delve deeper into the contexts in space and time, but without the human mentality that led to the creation of such contexts, so it also has those limitations. We have a lot of limitations here. So what we have here are sources that unfortunately do not convey a concrete collective mentality, nor will the sense, meaning, desire, intention, and purpose be right there in the open. A written testimony or an object will not automatically give us historical significance. This has been said here many times. An account can be distorted, exaggerated, distorted for political ends. In this very useful source, More Than Mythology, by several authors, we have, for example, Neil Price, who says, and very well put in relation to Norse mythology, but it is also applicable to other literary sources, and I quote, please. Any mythology as we have it today is an unorganic thing, something that has evolved over a long period. The stories have been told and retold on countless occasions. Elements have been added or fallen away. Details have been changed or embellished, probably thousands of times. Sometimes several versions are in circulation at once. Many mythologies contain internal contradictions, and that of the Scandinavians is certainly no exception. There is also the factor of transmission to consider. All the copyists' errors and biases over the centuries, as well as the deliberate distortions and suppressions. In relation to an object found and studied by archaeology, it also does not necessarily clarify its use and meaning, the purpose for which it was made. Speaking, of course, of objects with a magical religious utility and not everyday utensils that are still today quite familiar to us. However, we know some details about the places of worship, the space where some pagan religious practices took place. Regarding the Nordic cultural world, we know that at least in Iceland, it seems that the places of worship were open-air altars. There are places whose name includes the element, of course, of höger, or sacrificial altar. To be more precise, a place of worship being an altar erected on some high place. It is difficult to know if there were sacred buildings per se, but it is possible that the residences of the local lords or landowners, who also performed the priestly function, held the celebratory festivities, and the lords' residences were used as places for the celebration of ceremonies. As I've said before in other videos, the most extensive description of Viking Age Scandinavian religious practices comes from the 11th century German Christian chronicler Adam of Bremen, and he described a temple at the Swedish capital of Gamla Uppsala, which is fairly late in the culmination of Scandinavian Iron Age, where we already see several Christian influences in that period, 11th century. Take the example of the runestones, famous runestones, which the great majority, not all of them, but the great majority, were precisely raised in the 11th century with the official Christianization of Sweden. And there are many Christian elements present in such runestones, as well as pagan motifs, of course. Archaeologists to this day have searched in vain so far for any hint of the great temple at Old Uppsala, although the surrounding area is filled with burial mounds dating back as far as the Bronze Age, but no trace has been found, not yet, of the building described by Adam of Bremen. Elsewhere, evidences of pagan temples of the Scandinavian Viking Age are largely absent, but recently there's been found a couple of temples from that period, so there wasn't a total absence of pagan temples or buildings or cultic buildings in this context. But it isn't certain how much of a pagan practice this really was, and if it was customary for pagans of this period to raise temples, or if it was simply in very distinct spaces ruled by a wealthy lord who raised these temples or buildings following the Christian tradition of having churches. Because these temples really are from a very late period and with heavy Christian influences in the social and religious panorama of Scandinavia in these periods since before the official Christianization. Again, the main pagan scheme of places of worship was usually on prominent landscape features and raising altars, and temples in Scandinavia wasn't that common, it would seem. However, numerous places in Iceland include the element hoof, temple, in their name, but whether there was a specific building for such a use is far from being proven in the Icelandic context. One thing is Scandinavia and another thing is Iceland. The concept of temple from place to place and from period to period clearly had different understandings. Mind you that I am not denying the existence of temples in pagan Scandinavian contexts of the Viking period. There is no evidence of professional and regular priests in the pre-Christian Scandinavian religious world, but thanks to archaeology, which came to demystify many beliefs and came to even show the wrong assumptions in the literary sources, in recent discoveries there are some evidences at least that there were closed buildings, actual structures, built specifically or especially for cultic practices. Although we do not know how common this was, and the likely scenario here were special requests by local political and military authorities as well as by wealthy lords and landowners to express their wealth and power, raising these specific buildings of worship following the custom of other cultures Scandinavians had considerable contact with outside Scandinavia. For the Icelandic context, we have only two descriptions of a supposed pagan temple, and they derive from two sagas, one composed during the 13th century, the Herivia saga, the other is in the 15th century, the Kelsinga saga. I suggest you read these two sagas to get a sense of how a temple is described in an Icelandic context. But once again, don't forget that not only are we not dealing with a Scandinavian context, but also that they are very late sources, one from the 13th century and the other from the 15th century. The earliest account of these two, the Herivia saga, was written more than 200 years after Christianization was accepted in assembly as the official religion of Iceland. Not surprisingly, the description of the temple from the earlier saga, not only in structural terms but also in relation to some practices, is quite similar with the structure of a Catholic church and with Christian ritual practices. In fact, the author, in his description, compares it with a church specifically. In the innermost part of the temple, there was a space similar to the choirs of today's churches, with a platform in the middle that served as an altar. He also says that over the altar was placed a sacrificial chalice, in which was placed a sprinkler used to sprinkle the blood of the chalice. The blood was, which was called sacrifice, was the blood of animals offered to the gods. Several elements here are the same as in ancient Rome, whose customs Christians adopted and consequently carried these religious acts elsewhere. The description of the temple in the Kelsinga saga, 15th century, tells us of a temple with larger dimensions and almost entirely dedicated to Thor, being the most popular deity even during Christianity, since he became quite popular, not as a god in later periods, but a figure in folklore and folk magic traditions. But I ask you to read these sagas and draw your conclusions. However, I must say that it is very likely that the description in the Kelsinga saga, the most recent source, is largely derived from that of Herivia saga, the earlier one, 13th century. Although there are some differences, but it really does look like a later copy with some changes, so the author was not based on something that he physically knows of its existence, but based on a written source from the 13th century. But yes, there are many similarities with a large number of details of Christian worship, which has been mentioned numerous times by various scholars and academics. If I haven't forgotten, I have put the description of the temples here on the screen, so you must have noticed surely that the question of the tax to be paid to the temple is very similar to the tithe paid to the churches, a tax for the support of the church and clergy. Another example we can see in those sources, the effigy of Thor, the god Thor, larger in size, but with those of other smaller deities on the sides, recalls the representations of Christ flanked by a number of saints. The unquenchable fire is not very credible, however, especially in the context of a wooden building, a wooden structure, and it is a unique detail in this saga in particular that some scholars see as borrowing an element from the tradition of classical Greco-Roman temples to embellish the account, but also to be taken into consideration that throughout the Middle Ages the classical accounts were quite popular among Christians, and several copies of classical works were created by the clergy. We also have the metal cup, or the chalice, in which the sacrificial blood was collected, which resembles the chalice which, in the Catholic rite, contains the blood of Christ. The sprinkling of blood recalls that of the holy water in Christian rites. The architectural descriptions, and in particular that of the Herivia saga, with the clear comparison between the internal space of the temple and the choirs of Christian churches, seems to be inspired by that of the churches of the time and not by a true historical evidence. You get the point, right? So it is very likely that these authors of these sources were not based on something concrete and real in relation to a Nordic pagan temple, but an imagination severely influenced by the religious period in which they lived, these authors, which was Catholicism, changing some elements to what was thought at this point what must have been pagan practices and places of worship. So, far from being faithful accounts that have survived for at least 2 centuries in collective memory, these descriptions are rather a mirror of how Christian Icelanders imagined their pagan past, adding twisted details like human sacrifices and sprinkling of blood to a set of familiar elements to the authors and a set of ideas deducted from the religion of their time and their own religious ideals and beliefs. However, animal sacrifice was indeed a religious custom. Animal sacrifice occupied a central role in the pagan rite. So that much is true because that's something that actually continued to a certain extent, continued to be practiced for a very long time. And we can find it in archaeology. In Scandinavia, we have already seen that in some places there were pagan temples. However, we cannot deny the Christian influences that intervened in the religious panorama of these periods and the corruption of information that occurs in the course of oral transmission, as well as the prejudices and the bias of the account in favor of the religious ideals and morals of the authors and copyists who recorded and transmitted this material. As I said, animal sacrifice is something that was customary in Nordic pagan religious practices and other pagan practices. Through the source Haakon's saga, we know that it was customary when a sacrifice was performed for all the peasants, all the people, to gather in the place where the space of ritual and worship was. Various kinds of animals, even horses, were sacrificed. Apparently with branches, the walls of the temple, inside and out, and the altar as well, and also the people were bathed in blood. The meat of the sacrificed animals was then cooked and consumed. The saga tells us also about chalices and the person responsible for the party, for the ceremony. The Lord blessed the chalices and all the meat. First, the cup of Odin was emptied, which should be dedicated to the victory and honor of the king and or the Lord. Then that of Njörður and Freyr for peace and prosperity. Although I should say, and as I have presented on other videos, even though animals were quite present in many ritual performances of this historical context, they weren't always sacrificed and consumed. There are examples in sagas of pigs and boars kept as pets, special pets, and are presented at the ceremonies as sacred animals on which, and in the presence of such animals, oaths and all sorts of vows were taken. But when the ceremony was over, the animals were kept alive and would be presented again in such ceremonies for the next time. This can be consulted in Heidrik's saga, speaking of a sacrifice called Snorablot in honor of Freyr, which the ritual toast is made in the presence of a boar as the sacred animal of the deity, but the animal is not killed. But let's go back to the source Haakon's saga that brings us numerous doubts, raising more questions than answers. In fact, this is a good teaching moment on how we should pay attention, close attention to these sources, because the first thing we should notice is the total absence of details such as the nature of the blessings, the formulas invoked, the procedure for killing the animals and for the blessing in itself. There are several details missing and unexplained here, and how and who did the various things described here, and why and how. We do not know if we are really reading an ancient custom or a widespread and consolidated practice, or limited to a specific time and space. It could have been something common or something sporadic, and it could have been something widespread or regional, local, or even a specific unique event in relation to this context and this particular event alone. So there really isn't a lot of details concerning this religious practice. However, what really feels to be true and something that was customary to do, and we have evidence confirmed by archaeology as well, is animal sacrifice. But this is the only element that we can trust that it was made, and it does not prove that everything else that is reported in this source or in these sources is reliable, because as we have seen in previous sources, there are always a lot of fabricated, invented, reinvented, false or forged elements, depending a lot on who wrote it, why, when, and for whom. So I think it's clear that it's naive to think that it is possible to reconstruct a coherent picture of the pre-Christian Nordic religious world just by relying on the sources we have, especially when it comes to written sources at least 200 years after conversion. We have some elements described, yes, but they have often been proven not to be true in relation to the pre-Christian pagan religious world of the Nordic people, especially dealing with the culmination of the Iron Age in Scandinavia, the so-called Viking Age. Furthermore, with the elements at our disposal, it is absolutely impossible to create a detailed picture of the development of the religious moments, and any modern neo-pagan religious form cannot be taken as a reliable reference to the religious reality of the Nordic pre-Christian religious reality of the past. But this is not just a reality for Nordic paganism. This is, unfortunately, a general reality in relation to various pre-Christian religious expressions and practices. To finalize this video, I would like to answer a question posed by one of my patrons, which is tied to the main subject of this video, which is, in an alternative history, how would the Old Norse religion be called if there was never a Christianization and to this day the belief systems of Northern Europe had a continuous existence without interruption? It's a very interesting question. Just like Christianity, which is called Christianity, and the various branches also have names, perhaps we could also find a name if the Old Norse belief systems were consolidated into one single faith, forming a religion and having its own dogmas and canons. Of course, there is the name Ásatrú for particular modern age religious expressions based on some motifs and ideas of the past, several of which do not correspond to actual evidences of the Nordic pagan past. But I'm not going to speak of Ásatrú again, which is a name I do not agree with if it is used to express Nordic pagan beliefs, because it does not include a lot of important factors of the belief systems of this historical and geographical reality, and the name itself is quite limiting and therefore would not have been a good name for the consolidation of pre-Christian Nordic belief systems. In fact, naming or renaming religious manifestations does not imply a better understanding of them. In fact, since the current religious manifestation was given the name of Ásatrú, it has actually been creating more doubts and generating more questions than answers in relation to the history of the religious past from which this new religion draws and is inspired by some past elements. We have to take into consideration what exactly constitutes a religion or what is understood as a religion. Perhaps we can say that there is a difference between religion and religiosity based on the difference between what is practiced by a religious institution, so it forms a religion, and what is practiced at a collective level, religiosity. The problem here is that both a religion and a religiosity, or rather both religion and belief systems, in one way or another are hybrid constructs or constructions. And in a way, there is an element of cultural flexibility. And perhaps the only difference is that a religion is the end product of a structuring of beliefs until it forms a sect in which a group will obey to its stipulated canons. And religiosity, from systems of belief, is something broader, more flexible, open to evolution, and where there is greater freedom to the point of providing an adaptation of the religious that is modeled to the individual eventually forming several distinct religious practices but with some common elements. And that is how Nordic paganism was, just like other paganisms. However, this leads us to think that a religion is something uniform. And so it seems, due to the structure that facilitates religious and cultural elements and thus forms a religion. But no religion can be duly considered uniform. I think we could perhaps say that a religion is what has an institutional representation, so the lack of this element in religiosity makes systems of belief not a religion but a religiosity, in the sense of being more encompassing, inclusive, and flexible in religious practice. I hope I'm making myself clear. Therefore, for a better example, according to this perspective, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because they are apparently uniform and have a well-established institutional structure, would be considered religions, while other religious movements would receive terms other than that of religion. Although I may agree with this understanding to a certain extent, the more I think about it, the less I agree with it. And this approach is questionable because the concept of religion is thus understood only on the basis of the organization of Abrahamic religions. Every religious manifestation, regardless of its institutionalization, is syncretic and dynamic by nature. There is no pure, linear, or static religion, and that includes the Abrahamic ones as well. That is why institutional representation is not enough to say whether something is a religion or not. If it were that easy or that simple, pre-Christian Nordic belief systems are really not a religion because they didn't have an institutional representation in the past. We can't limit the idea of religion to an institution. So far, the best way to identify pagan religiosities is to call them belief systems, or alternative terms such as ritualized tradition, cumulative tradition, or just calling it religiosity. As I have used in the title of this video, religious practice, which is not the same thing as religion. All religions have a religious practice, but not all religious practices are religions. A good alternative name has already actually been given and is a well-known one and better than Ásatrú, which is fornseer or fornseid, meaning ancient custom or ancient tradition, referring to ancient pagan practices and beliefs that were held in Scandinavia before the influence and the conversion of Christianity, being a broader term maintaining the flexibility and inclusiveness of religious practice. In terms of Nordic religion in an alternative history, that's a hard one to formulate. The fact that there was never a religion in pre-Christian Northern Europe or a religious institution, but instead a set of belief systems and ritualized practices which shows religious expressions and a religiosity, always prone to change and evolution, is precisely what led to the survival of many viewpoints into the pagan animistic mind of Northern Europe, mostly kept in old stories, myths, and folklore. It's curious that religions have the tendency to be forgotten eventually, because even though they usually have scriptures that retains much of the religious mentality of a particular religion, it creates a set of rules and a clear religious canon that leads to stagnation and an obsolete mentality, incapable of being fluid. Therefore, people get tired of such religions when there's no room for new ideas that help people deal with problems of their own time period. The beauty of paganism isn't the religions of the state, but the cults and belief systems of the people, which are always adapted to the daily life circumstances, which preserves the animistic mentality and the things people do in order to keep alive the relationships they have with one another and with the natural world. As we have seen previously, certainly pagan belief systems are eventually also forgotten, mostly in meaning and practice. Eventually forgotten just like religions, but the essence remains active because it's open to evolution and people will always be drawn to them, precisely because such belief systems are always adaptable, and as such will always be current and active. Surely in different forms and meanings, but the animistic basis behind them continues to be relevant and drawing people's curiosity and attention. Answering the question, if there was a pre-Christian Nordic religion, many things may have been preserved, but at this point, it would eventually fall into disuse and people would turn away from it just the same way they eventually turn away from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, etc. There's a reason why animistic indigenous belief systems are still alive, and to this day people still find them absolutely fascinating, because they are fluid. They are belief systems capable of being present all the time, shaped to fit human needs and wishes all the time in every age of the world. If there would have been a Nordic religion, it would be dying by this time, and not a lot of people would be interested in it, the same way many of us are right now interested in the mysteries of the belief systems of Northern Europe right now, and other paganisms. There is a certain appealing to the human mind because it becomes mysterious and unfamiliar, because we have lost much of the knowledge about it. And this will keep happening. Paganisms are on the rise, but one day they will feel so familiar again that they shall lose their mysterious elements. And the more we institutionalize them, and the more religious manifestations we create over them, over paganisms, the less interesting they become, because limits are drawn or set, and eventually they become saturated, and people will try to seek something that keeps feeding the human spirit of curiosity. Which is why animism will always be relevant and interesting, because it is not institutionalized, and there's a multiplicity of occurrences and experiences according to the infinite multiplicity of human thought and existence. This may be the reason why many neo-pagan many neo-pagan people are already growing tired of religious institutions such as Wicca and Ásatrú and others. Something so recent, because it is a religion and therefore an expression with limitations that doesn't give room or even allows evolution of thought. Animism, just like humans, expands and evolves all the time, unlike fixed religions. But if indeed there would be a name for a surviving Nordic religion in an alternative history, then we would have to look to the more fixable systems of belief of Viking Age belief systems, which were in temples. Temples, as said before, in sporadic and very distinct contexts controlled by a local lord or landowner, and such temples that held only some gods, usually the triad of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. In later periods, the religion would most likely be around this triad, and given the fact that such temples were controlled by aristocracy, and around this triad of gods, a Nordic religion would easily have the name of Holy Trinity. And that isn't very good, is it? Or at the very least, Nordic Holy Trinity. The term Nordic in academic studies in relation to this context of pre-Christian religiosity is used as Old Nordic religion, which can be another alternative name because it refers to the cultural sphere that belongs to or is related to the people of Scandinavia and of Iceland, which are not all from the same cultural and ethnic groups. But it covers a geography with some common religious elements. I think it would be a mistake to call it the old Scandinavian religion, which only denotes the geography of the regions that today correspond to Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, since Iceland is not Scandinavia, but it is Nordic. Sometimes Finland is included too, and other Finno-Ugric peoples who are not Scandinavian, but are Nordic, so the term Nordic will be the best to apply. Of course, this is a modern category as well as a modern cultural invention, which was not used by the peoples of the past we are dealing with here, but whose term, the Nordic term, contributes to the better understanding of the object in study or the object of study. The expression Old Nordic religion, therefore, in reference to the religions and belief systems shared by the Nordic peoples in general. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. I know this video was quite long, but I hope it was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje.